In 1943, German aces looked up and laughed. The new American fighter, fat, slow, and awkward, was a joke in every Luftwaffe briefing. They called it the flying milk bottle. But just months later, that laughter would turn to terror, because when the P-47 Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns opened fire, the sky itself became a death trap. This is the story of how a punchline became the most feared sound in Europe and why, for thousands of German pilots, the joke would be on them. April 8, 1943. The sky above France was a cold, endless blue, the kind of clarity that pilots both loved and feared. At 27,000 feet, the world was reduced to sunlight. The laughter was genuine. To the German aces, who had spent years dueling Spitfires and Yaks, the new American P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a joke. It was massive, almost comically so, with a barrel-shaped fuselage, a greenhouse canopy, and a propeller that seemed to belong on a bomber. The Thunderbolt's wings looked stubby, its lines ungainly. In the Luftwaffe's ready rooms, pilots swapped stories and nicknames: the jug, the flying bathtub, the pregnant cow. They were certain these machines would be easy prey. But what the Germans didn't know, what no one in Europe yet understood, was that the P-47 was about to rewrite the rules of air combat. The laughter would not last. In less than 2 years, the very sight of a Thunderbolt would send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened Luftwaffe veterans. The transformation from ridicule to terror would be swift, brutal, and absolute. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not just the tale of a machine. It is the story of a revolution in design, tactics, and industrial might. It is a story of American engineers who dared to build a fighter unlike any the world had seen, of pilots who learned to master its quirks and unleash its power, and of German aces who discovered, too late, that their old tricks no longer worked. It is a story of how 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, dismissed as inferior by many, became the most feared sound in the European sky. To understand why the Germans laughed, you have to understand what they were used to. The Luftwaffe's best fighters, the Bf-109 and the Fw-190, were products of a design philosophy that prized agility, climb rate, and turn performance. These were lightweight, nimble machines, optimized for the swirling dogfights that had defined air combat since the First World War. German pilots were trained to exploit every ounce of their aircraft's maneuverability, to outturn and outclimb their opponents, to strike from above and vanish before the enemy could react. The P-47, by contrast, seemed to defy every rule. When Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, first unveiled the prototype in 1941, even American test pilots were skeptical. The XP-47B weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, almost twice as much as a Spitfire. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, with its complex turbo-supercharger system, gave the fuselage a bloated, almost pregnant appearance. The cockpit was roomy, the landing gear robust, the wings thick and strong. It looked, as one British observer put it, like a flying bulldog. But beneath the awkward exterior was a masterpiece of brute force engineering. The R280 engine could deliver 2,000 horsepower at altitude, thanks to its turbo supercharger, which fed sea-level air to the engine even at 30,000 feet. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any fighter in the world, reaching speeds that approached the sound barrier. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, could unleash a storm of lead over 6,000 rounds per minute, with a combined ammunition load of 3,400 rounds. The P-47 was not built to dance. It was built to survive, to hit hard, and to bring its pilot home. The first American pilots to fly the Thunderbolt in combat were not impressed. The P-47 was a handful on takeoff and landing, prone to ground loops and torque rolls. It was slow to climb, sluggish in turns, and unforgiving to the inexperienced. Training accidents were common, and many pilots longed for the familiar handling of the P-40 or the Spitfire. But those who persevered discovered something extraordinary. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would destroy any other fighter. Its radial engine was nearly immune to battle damage, lacking the vulnerable coolant systems of liquid-cooled engines. The cockpit was protected by thick armor, the fuel tank self-sealing. Pilots returned from missions with their aircraft riddled with holes, engines coughing and controls barely responsive, but alive. The Germans, at first, saw only the weaknesses. In the spring of 1943, as the 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe aces eagerly awaited their chance to tangle with the new American fighter. They were not disappointed. In the first month of operations, the P-47 groups lost 14 aircraft for only 3 confirmed German kills. Reports from the front were scathing. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow," one German squadron leader reported. The Americans, it seemed, had built a target, not a fighter. But beneath the surface, the balance was already shifting. The P-47's weaknesses were real, but so were its strengths. American pilots, learning from bitter experience, began to adapt their tactics. They stopped trying to outturn the Germans. Instead, they used the Thunderbolt's weight and power to their advantage. They climbed high, above the German formations, and waited. When the enemy appeared, they rolled inverted and dove, using gravity to accelerate to incredible speeds. At the bottom of the dive, they unleashed their 850s in a devastating pass, then zoomed back to altitude before the Germans could react. The Luftwaffe called it the boom and zoom. The Americans called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. The first hints of the Thunderbolt's true potential came in the spring of 1943, as pilots like Major Donald Blakesley and Lieutenant Robert Johnson began to rack up victories. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, would become one of America's top aces, with 27 confirmed kills. He described his first flight in the P-47 as like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was overwhelming, the firepower unmatched. In combat, Johnson learned to trust his machine. On one mission, his Thunderbolt was hit by over 200 rounds of enemy fire, the canopy shattered, the engine smoking, the controls barely responsive. Yet the aircraft brought him home. By the summer of 1943, the laughter was fading. German pilots began to notice that the P-47s they shot down often returned to base, riddled with holes but still flying. They noticed, too, that when the Thunderbolt's guns found their mark, the results were catastrophic. Aircraft caught in the convergence zone of 850s didn't just fall, they disintegrated. The Luftwaffe's confidence began to waver. The transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt from a subject of ridicule to a symbol of terror was not instantaneous. It was a process, a slow and relentless shift in the balance of power that played out in the skies over France, Belgium, and Germany. The Germans, masters of tactical innovation, were quick to adapt their strategies. They learned to attack the Thunderbolts from below, where the heavy American fighters struggled to respond. They forced turning fights at medium altitudes, exploiting the P-47's sluggishness and the horizontal plane. For a time, these tactics worked, the Luftwaffe's aces. many of whom had survived the crucible of the Battle of Britain and the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, continued to rack up victories. But the Americans were learning, too. The key to the Thunderbolt's eventual dominance lay not just in its design, but in the way it was used. American pilots, under the leadership of innovative commanders like Colonel Hubert Zemck, began to develop new tactics that played to the P-47's strengths. Zemck, a former engineering student with a keen analytical mind, understood that the Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter in the traditional sense. It was a weapon of speed, altitude, and firepower. He drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them to avoid turning engagements and instead to use the vertical dimension of the battlefield. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns, he told his pilots. The result was a new style of air combat, one that the Germans were ill-prepared to counter. The impact of these new tactics was dramatic. In a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. From 30,000 feet, it could reach speeds of over 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve. Even in a vertical dive, this speed could be converted into altitude in a zoom climb, leaving pursuing fighters helplessly behind. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns, when fired in a coordinated pass, created a wall of lead that no enemy aircraft could survive. German pilots who survived these encounters described it as flying into a storm of bullets, a convergent zone of destruction that left nothing but burning wreckage in its wake. One of the most legendary encounters in the history of aerial warfare occurred on June 26, 1943, over Le Touquet, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was returning from an escort mission when his formation was ambushed by a group of Focke-Wulf 190s led by the formidable Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland. Johnson's Thunderbolt was hit almost immediately, cannon shells exploding across the fuselage, the canopy shattering, hydraulic fluid spraying into the cockpit. Wounded and half-blinded, Johnson tried to bail out, only to discover that the canopy was jammed shut by a shell fragment, trapped in a dying aircraft. He did the only thing he could. He pointed the nose toward England and prayed. What happened next became the stuff of legend. A lone FW-190, piloted by an unknown German ace, spotted the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel. The German pilot made repeated attack runs, emptying his cannons and machine guns into Johnson's aircraft. The P-47 absorbed the punishment, its engine coughing, its controls barely responsive. But it refused to die. Finally, out of ammunition and out of options, the German pilot pulled alongside, shook his head in disbelief, and saluted before peeling away. Johnson's Thunderbolt made it back to base. Riddled with over 200 bullet holes, the mechanics who examined the wreckage were astonished. The aircraft had taken hits that would have destroyed any other fighter. Yet it had brought its pilot home. Stories like Johnson's spread quickly, both among the Americans and their adversaries. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers, initially skeptical, began to take notice. Reports from the front lines described Thunderbolts returning from missions with wings shredded, engines shot to pieces, and yet still flying. The German pilots, who had once mocked the P-47 as a flying milk bottle, now spoke of it with a mixture of respect and fear. They called it der fliegende Amboss, the flying anvil. The Americans, for their part, were quick to capitalize on the Thunderbolt's strengths. By the late summer of 1943, new variants of the P-47 were arriving in England, equipped with paddle blade propellers that dramatically improved climb rate and acceleration. The addition of external fuel tanks extended the Thunderbolt's range, allowing it to escort bombers deep into German territory. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by the demands of a two-front war, found itself increasingly on the defensive. The psychological impact of the Thunderbolt's firepower cannot be overstated. German pilots who survived encounters with the P-47 often describe the experience in visceral terms. The sound of 8.50 caliber machine guns firing in unison was unlike anything else in the war, a deep, mechanical roar that signaled instant death. Aircraft caught in the convergence zone were not merely shot down, they were obliterated, torn apart by streams of incendiary and armor-piercing rounds. The Luftwaffe's own assessments, once dismissive, became increasingly alarmed. By late 1943, German intelligence classified the P-47 as a critical threat at all altitudes. The transformation of the Thunderbolt was not limited to the air war over Europe and the Pacific. The P-47 proved equally formidable. Its rugged construction and long range made it ideal for the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were stunned by the Thunderbolt's durability and firepower. Saburo Sokai, one of Japan's top aces, later recalled, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away." By early 1944, the P-47 had evolved into a true multi-role weapon. New variants could carry bombs and rockets, transforming the Thunderbolt into a devastating ground attack platform. The D-5 model, with its reinforced wings and improved engine, could deliver a bomb load equal to that of a medium bomber. The addition of high-velocity aircraft rockets gave the P-47 the ability to destroy tanks, trains, and armored vehicles with ease. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 500 Thunderbolts provided air cover for the Allied invasion, creating an impenetrable shield over the beaches of Normandy. The days following D-Day marked a turning point not only in the ground war but in the air as well. The Luftwaffe, already battered and depleted, found itself facing an enemy that seemed to have mastered the art of aerial dominance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once the butt of jokes in German ready rooms, now ruled the skies with a combination of brute force and relentless presence. German pilots who attempted to intercept Allied bombers over Normandy quickly discovered that the old tactics no longer worked. The Thunderbolts were everywhere, stacked in layers from sea level to 30,000 feet, waiting at every altitude, their guns ready to unleash devastation. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of the few German pilots to survive the air battles over the beaches, later recalled the sense of helplessness that gripped his squadron. "We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. The psychological toll was immense. Luftwaffe pilots began to speak of Jobbo fever, fighter-bomber fever, a kind of dread that set in whenever Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Even the most experienced aces, men who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching, found themselves gripped by a new and unfamiliar fear. The statistics from the Normandy campaign tell a story of overwhelming force. In June 1944 alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed the destruction of over 650 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, more than 500 tanks and armored vehicles, and thousands of horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, and even then, the threat of a sudden, thundering attack from above was never far away. German ground troops learned to recognize the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine and the terrifying scream of its rockets. Survivors described the experience as being hunted by flying artillery. The transformation of the P-47 from a high-altitude escort to a low-level ground attack monster was a testament to both American ingenuity and industrial might. The Luftwaffe tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, and developed new camouflage techniques. But nothing seemed to work. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made it nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. The Germans' only real hope was to avoid detection altogether, a near impossible task in the open fields and roads of France. While the Thunderbolt was devastating Europe, it was also proving its worth in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, discovered that the P-47's qualities were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics specifically for the theater. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over WWII, shooting down 6 enemy planes himself in a single mission and earning the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the Thunderbolt's combination of firepower and durability. Saburo Sokoi, the legendary Japanese ace, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying. Streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart." The P-47N, developed specifically for the Pacific, featured increased fuel capacity, with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, extending its range to over 2,300 miles. This variant would escort B-29s to Japan, proving that the short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon. The Thunderbolt's adaptability was unmatched. It could fight at 30,000 feet or strafe a train at treetop level. It could escort bombers deep into enemy territory or blast tanks off the road with rockets and machine guns. It was, in every sense, the ultimate multi-role fighter of World War II, perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 262, with its 540 miles per hour top speed, should have been untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. But Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets into situations during takeoff and landing, when the jets were most vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from altitude. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting power to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. The P-47 had come a long way from the days when German pilots laughed at its ungainly silhouette. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day offensive in 1945, would become a final, tragic testament to the shifting fortunes of air power in Europe. Nearly 900 German fighters, including many of their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post, pointed at the burning wreckage and sneered. "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking's response would become legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He simply pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hardstands for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones." "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German smirk vanished. "Within 48 hours. Factory fresh P-47D40s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders. These losses could never be replaced. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, all replaced within a week. The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. The scale of American production was staggering. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak production, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every hour. Round the clock, the Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, -1 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women, who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with a precision that exceeded peacetime standards. The logistics behind the Thunderbolt's operations were equally impressive. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, with hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions. Ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition plants, produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through the synchronized gun mechanisms. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection engaged. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass product. Iron, even more impressive than aircraft production, was pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training, more than Germany had trained in the entire war. Each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. German pilots, by contrast, were entering combat with less than 100 hours total time by war's end. The quality showed in combat. American pilots arrived in Europe trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, and tactics. They had practiced against captured German aircraft, understanding their enemy's capabilities and limitations. They knew their aircraft systems intimately, having studied technical manuals that German pilots never received. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage I had for 120 hours in my logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from actual combat. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. The contrast was stark. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. The final months of the war saw the Luftwaffe reduced to a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins. But even with aircraft and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. Attacking meant facing P-47 formations that owned every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brechtender, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, for thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded. The wings separated. I barely escaped. And the parachute. I watched them destroy my entire staff. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained, burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact was complete. German pilots developed what medical officers called Jobberfieber, physical symptoms of stress appearing when thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions. Against P-47s, the distinctive thunder of approaching thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops, who knew that survival meant finding cover immediately. The Luftwaffe's own records, captured in 1945, revealed the complete reversal of opinion. In April 1943, large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed, machine gun armament, insufficient against cannon-armed fighters, assessment, minimal threat. By March 1945, best fighter bomber of the war, combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched, pilot quality exceptional, assessment, unsurvivable in direct engagement.
In the aftermath of war, the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt was written not just in the statistics of destruction, but in the memories and testimonies of those who had faced it on both sides of the conflict. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The transformation of the P-47 from an object of derision to an instrument of annihilation was a testament to the power of adaptation, innovation, and sheer industrial might. The Thunderbolt's design philosophy was unapologetically American, overbuilt, overpowered, and engineered for survival. Its wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 grams forces. The control cables were doubled throughout with automatic backup systems. The ammunition feed system alone was a marvel of engineering. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, fed through electric boost motors to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. The convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, allowing pilots to optimize for their preferred engagement range, even after the war. Some German veterans maintained that the P-47 won through quantity, not quality, that German fighters were technically superior, but overwhelmed by numbers. The combat records, however, tell a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, P-47s consistently prevailed. The heavy machine gun armament, dismissed as inferior to cannon, proved more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, require precise aim and have limited ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds total. The P-47's weapons created a probability cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits even with imperfect aim. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst put at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to ensure destruction. The ammunition itself was superior. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds use a delayed action fuse that ensured penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure. German 20mm shells, while heavier, often exploded on surface contact, causing spectacular but sometimes superficial damage. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. The transformation of German opinion from mockery to terror took less than 2 years. In that time, the flying milk bottle became the most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed tones decades after the war. At a 1985 reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former adversaries met in peace. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response, recorded on video, captured the complete transformation. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable. The visibility, excellent. The controls, precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. Yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The P-47's design represented American industrial philosophy perfectly. Brute force engineering, backed by unlimited resources. Every component was designed to survive the worst the enemy could throw at it. The result was a fighter that could take hits, keep flying, and keep fighting. It was not the most elegant aircraft of the war, nor the most agile, but it was the most survivable, the most adaptable, and, in the end, the most feared. The final statistics of P-47 operations defy comprehension in Europe. 3,750 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. Destroyed in the Pacific, 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 on the ground, 1,500 vehicles, 150 locomotives, countless barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Behind these numbers lay the human cost. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces. Many fell to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could never replace. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. The sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Thunderbolt. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a story of transformation of how laughter turned to fear, and how a machine dismissed as a flying milk bottle became the instrument of annihilation. It is a story of American ingenuity, determination, and the relentless pursuit of victory. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.
If you were surprised by the true story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, imagine what else history is hiding. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another untold WWII story. Which fighter do you think was the most underrated of the war? Drop your answer in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow history fans. Thanks for watching, and keep the thunder rolling.